All right, welcome to our summer Bible study series on the book of Romans. We are trying some new stuff. I'm excited about this. I'm excited for our study of Romans. This should be good, and I want to just, in this session, provide some context and historical background for the book of Romans. I personally believe that Romans is enhanced when you understand why it was written and the context that it was written to. And this is something we do with every epistle of the New Testament except Romans, it seems like to me. I mean, we know the context of Galatians, we know the context of Colossians, we know the context of the Gospels, but I found generally when we do teaching on Romans, we just get straight to the content without ever looking at the context. So this first session will actually mostly be history, what led up to the writing of Romans more than the actual content. And then the next 5 sessions we'll look at the content of Romans. So I want to pray for us and then jump into this. Lord, as we look at your word, I pray that you would sharpen our minds, help us to understand how you weaved world events together to advance the gospel, how you moved on the hearts of emperors and politicians and leaders in a way that saw the gospel advance and the gospel spread. And so help us to understand Romans in its context, and I pray that in your name. Amen. All right, so this is going to feel a little bit like I'm telling a story because in a way I am. I want you to imagine the early church in the first 50 years of the first century. So Jesus died in approximately 33 to 36 AD, and during that time, there was no New Testament yet, obviously, because that was still being written, and even the development of the early church was still in its very, very early stages. Most of the followers of Jesus were Jewish, not non-Jewish Gentiles. The term Gentile just refers to anyone that's not Jewish. So I'm going to use that a lot. You're going to read that a lot in the book of Romans. Most of the followers of Jesus were Jewish, and so these Jewish followers would go to their synagogues, their little local congregations of Jewish people, and when they had made a decision to follow Jesus and responded to Jesus, they did not have to leave their synagogue. So they continued attending their synagogue. They did not throw off their culture. They did not get kicked out of the synagogue immediately. They began following Jesus in the midst of their existing Jewish synagogue. And at that point, the followers of Jesus, or the Way as it's referred to in Acts, the followers of Jesus were really seen just as simply a sect or a subset of Judaism. Nowadays we call these Messianic Jews, but that term didn't exist in the first century. But the Jewish followers of Jesus stayed in their synagogues. Now, for various reasons, they got dispersed. We read in Acts chapter 7, there's persecution in Jerusalem. Because there's persecution in Jerusalem, Jewish Christians scatter. Some of them go to Antioch, and some of them go to other places, and some of them end up in the city of Rome. So in Rome, you have these Jewish Christians that have had to leave Jerusalem. They're following Jesus, but they come from Jewish backgrounds, which means that they're familiar with Moses. You know, they understand the Old Testament. They understand the prophecies. They understand the celebrations and the holidays and all of those things. They would still celebrate those things, but they would find Jesus in things like the Passover and Sukkot and the Day of Atonement. They would find Jesus in those things. They primarily spoke Hebrew. So when they gathered, they would speak Hebrew. So they would talk about Jesus in their Jewish language. As I mentioned, at this point, it wasn't even considered separate from Judaism. It was considered a sect or like a little mini denomination of Judaism. And it went on like this for nearly 20 years in Rome. But over time, as the Jesus-following Jews and the Jews who did not follow Jesus, as they had more interactions and more discussions about Jesus, it was becoming clear that not everyone saw eye to eye on Jesus. And for 15 or so years, there were arguments between the Jewish people in Rome about whether Jesus was the Messiah. And actually those arguments were so prevalent that the emperor Claudius got tired of them, and in AD 49, Claudius made an edict that removed all Jewish people from the city of Rome. So this is actually kind of a racist law, but he's so tired of the Jewish people arguing over whether Jesus is the Messiah or not that he says, all Jewish people get out of Rome. So this is actually what the edict said. This is from a Roman historian named Suetonius, and he tells us what the edict said. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christ, or they argued about Jesus, Claudius expelled them from Rome. And this expulsion lasted approximately 5 years, so from AD 49 to AD 54. So these Jewish Christians who were meeting in Rome, as they were sharing the gospel, they were seeing non-Jewish people come to the faith. So we call them Greeks in the book of Romans. You'll see references to the Greeks. So this church, these followers of Jesus, was primarily Jewish with some non-Jewish other ethnicities and other races. The Greeks and maybe some other people were there. And so all of a sudden, this church that is majority Jewish Christians, all of the Jewish people are told to leave. I mean, think about how the dynamics of how this would have worked. You're a non-Jewish person, but you put your faith in Jesus. You show up in a church gathering, pretty much everyone there, most of the people there are Jewish. They're speaking a language you're not familiar with. They're referring to stories, guys like Abraham and Noah. Who are they? Because I didn't grow up Jewish, so I don't know these stories, you know. They're eating food that you're not familiar with, and maybe they're not eating food that you are familiar with. They're dancing dances that you're unfamiliar with. I mean, the whole experience would have been so full of Jewish culture with Jesus at the center of it. And then you come in as a non-Jewish person and you say, well, I like the Jesus part, but all of the rest of this I'm very unfamiliar with. And you would have kind of learned, you would have been somewhat integrated into that Jewish culture as a Greek person. So when all the Jewish people were moved out of Rome, all of a sudden this very Jewish church is left in the hands of non-Jewish people. They don't know the stories of Moses. They don't know Abraham. They don't know David. They don't understand why you can't eat pork, or they don't know the Day of Atonement. They don't know the Passover. They don't know what the tabernacle represented. They don't know the prophets that prophesied about Jesus. They've come to Jesus simply through the testimony of the early church. So they're not familiar with all the Jewish background. So for 5 years, Jewish people were expelled from the city of Rome. We actually find in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, that 2 of those Jewish believers were named Aquila and Priscilla. And they're actually in a different part of the world, and they come in Ephesus. They come across a man named Apollos. This is something we covered in our Ephesus series. Aquila and Priscilla, it says in Acts 18:2, were displaced because of the edict of Claudius, and God used them to minister and to lead and to disciple people in other places. But imagine your church. Imagine if there was a law that removed the majority of the people from your church. And imagine if you lost a lot of leaders because of that. So all of a sudden, this majority Jewish Christian church in Rome has lost most of its people and most of its leaders and the driving force of its culture, and it's left in the hands of a small number of non-Jewish Christians who are most likely Greek or other ethnicities. So that represents this huge shaking. As I mentioned, this took place for 5 years. After 5 years, Jewish people were allowed back in Rome. Claudius died, and when he died, the edict expired, and the Jewish people came back into Rome. And when they came back in, they went back to their churches. And you know what they found out? This is not the church I left. Why are you all eating pork and why are you eating these things? How come you're not talking about Moses? I hear you talking about Jesus, that's good, but why aren't you anchoring it in the stories in the Old Covenant? Why aren't you singing the songs? I hear no one speaking Hebrew here. You're all speaking Greek. See, there's no Hebrew people and there's no Jewish people in leadership. Everyone in leadership is Greek or barbarian or Scythian or some other ethnicity. What has happened to the church that we left? It used to be distinctly Jewish, and now it's not Jewish at all, and it leads to this tension. And within 1 to 3 years of the Jewish people coming back into Rome, the book of Romans is written. And Paul is writing Romans primarily to help Jewish Christians and Greek Christians understand how to relate to one another. You essentially have a church that has some sort of racial tension or conflict in it, and Paul's addressing that, and that's how he handles it. And you actually, when you understand that, it makes so much of Romans make sense. So I want to illustrate it this way. In 2017, I underwent a very public conversion to being a Philadelphia Eagles fan. I grew up a Cleveland Browns fan. I knew all the Browns players, had been to the stadium, grew up watching them, had the jerseys, all that stuff. But in 2017, I had had enough of the pain and suffering, and I decided this is a good year to jump on the Eagles bandwagon. Now, imagine if I start going to the Eagles games, and I realize, boy, there's Fly, Eagles, Fly. I've never heard of that song. And I'm not familiar with all the good old Eagles players. I've never heard of Harold Carmichael and Mike Quick, and I don't know who B-Doc is, and who's Randall Cunningham. I'm thinking of I know the old Browns players. I don't know the old Eagles players, and I got a Browns jersey. That's not going to make sense at an Eagles game, right? And so there's all these traditions that I have to learn. Imagine in the process of learning them that all of a sudden no one who was born in Philadelphia is allowed to go to Eagles games. And the only people that are allowed to go to the Eagles games are the new folks, the newbies, like me. And I'm in charge of the stands, and I don't know what songs we're supposed to sing. And so I just take the old Browns fight song and I try to make it an Eagles fight song. And I don't know. I know when I was a Browns fan, part of the bleachers were called the Dog Pound, and that's where the rowdiest fans sat. And so let's say I took the part of the Eagles Stadium behind the end zone, and I made it the Eagles Nest, and we had the most belligerent fans went to the Eagles Nest. And let's say I started, I don't know, I guess we're going to serve the same food that we would serve in Cleveland, and I would do that. And then after 5 years, the Eagles fans come back, and they're like, "What have you done to our team? You have banners and flyers up of players that never played for us. You have songs that we never sang. You have food that we never ate. You've changed the culture and the setting and the stadium. It's totally different now. What have you done?" And the conflict that would arise from that. I know that's a really good illustration. So in AD 54, when the Jewish people come back to Rome, they're coming back into a church that is not like the church they left. Who's going to be in leadership now? The Greek Christians who've been leading the church for the last 5 years, or the Roman Christians who are leading it when it was getting started? What language are they going to use in their meetings? Are they going to use Hebrew or Greek or Latin or Aramaic or some other language? How will they celebrate the holidays? Will they celebrate the Jewish holidays? How much familiarity do you have to have with the Old Testament stories in order to follow the teaching that happens in public settings? So this is what they're dealing with. There's a couple things that take place during this 5-year separation. First, this sped up the process whereby the Christian church began to separate itself and distinguish itself from the Jewish synagogue. Because as I said earlier, followers of Jesus are really just considered a type of Jew. But during those 5 years, these Greeks were not a type of Jew anymore. They were totally separate. So this is how the church and the synagogue, or Judaism and Christianity, began to kind of separate and distinguish themselves from one another. The ratio of Jewish followers of Jesus was greatly impacted by that. And you know now that most followers of Jesus do not come from Jewish backgrounds. We come from every other ethnicity, although there are still many Jewish followers of Jesus. It really challenged the unity of Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians who had to determine what's necessary to follow Jesus. You know, we used to always teach that you had to be circumcised, and now we're not so sure that that's necessary. That's actually one of the issues that Paul addresses in the book of Romans. Now, if you look through the book of Romans, just like a summary of Romans, you're going to find out there's kind of like 5 major movements in the book of Romans. The first 3 chapters is really Paul saying, hey, listen, we're all equal. We're all equally sinful. Gentiles, you're sinful, and he gives an argument for that. Jewish people, you're also sinful, and he gives an argument for that. You have this situation where 2 ethnic groups are kind of vying for control, and Paul equalizes things by sharing that they are both sinful in their own regard. You get to chapters 3, 5, and 6, we talk about justification by faith, which means, and what Paul was getting at there was you're justified by faith, you're not justified by your ethnicity. You're not Jewish people, you're not saved by virtue of being Jewish. Gentile people, you don't have to become Jewish to become Christian. Chapters 6, 7, and 8 really talk about the identity of a follower of Jesus. So Paul starts at the beginning of the book with you're equally sinful, and then he gets in chapters 6, 7, and 8 to this is what happened to all of us, regardless of our ethnicity, when we came to Christ. Chapters 9, 10, and 11, Paul uses some illustrations like an olive tree, a clay pot, and other illustrations to talk about how Jewish and non-Jewish Christians relate to one another and how Israel is an olive tree and non-Jewish Christians are grafted into the olive tree. Chapters 12, 13, and 14 and 15 talk about the practical applications of that, how you're going to serve one another through your spiritual gifts, how you're going to deal with difficult situations like what we can eat, what we can't eat, how we're going to defer to one another and not offend one another with those things, how we're even going to relate to the civil authorities and the government who put them in that situation in the first place. How do you deal with a government that caused division through its legislation? And then chapter 16 is just kind of like tying up the loose ends. So we want to read the book of Romans, understanding what's going on in the church here and understanding what Paul's trying to accomplish. He's actually trying to accomplish unity between these 2 groups of Christians. As we go through, I'm wrapping up here, as we go through Romans, there are 15 different rhetorical questions that Paul asks, just questions that he throws out there and that he answers. But they kind of hint that this is what he's getting at. In chapter 3, verse 1, Paul asks this rhetorical question, what advantage then is there in being Jewish? That's an interesting question to answer in that context. Verse 9 of chapter 3, are we Jewish people better than the Gentiles? He's dealing with a superiority-inferiority dynamic there. Romans 3:29, is God the God of the Jews only, or is he not the God of the Gentiles as well? Look at how he's attacking false beliefs and he's establishing right beliefs. He spends the entirety of chapters 1 and 3 establishing some sort of base level for equality. Chapters 4 through 6, an explanation of justification by faith as opposed to your ethnicity. He actually uses a Jewish illustration of Abraham to explain how non-Jewish people are saved. And so the book of Romans is really enriched when we understand the context it's written to and what Paul was trying to accomplish. He's trying to bring together 2 groups in Christ so that they can worship together because they don't need to split, they don't need to divide. They're living in first century Rome, they need each other. The world was a tough place at that time, and it's a tough place now. They needed each other. So that's what Paul's trying to accomplish as he writes Romans. The next 5 sessions, we'll be getting into specific concepts that are found in the content of Romans, and I look forward to getting into those with you.